grew up very competitive my whole life, and I knew that if I performed at my own personal best, I could accomplish what I wanted to accomplish. And so I started performing at my own personal best in everything that I did. And that led to me winning a lot. I won junior world championships. I became the first woman in the world to do a double flip, a double backflip at X Games. And I was traveling around the world, climbing up this mountain of life when all of a sudden I was at World Tour Finals with my little sister Jeannie. And it was her first World Tour Finals that she was competing in half pipe. And on that day, I gave her a hug. And I honestly don't remember anything that happened.
It was hard. I mean, she was unconscious immediately, so there was no part of the accident that leaves any scars in her in that way. But for me, seeing her, she was convulsing on the snow. She had bit her tongue, so there was blood coming out of her mouth. She really looked like a zombie. And it wasn't something, obviously, that I've ever seen before or after, but I knew that it was really serious. And I think I just kind of took it one step at a time. I didn't really have an option. There's a quote that I really like, that's proven to be true over and over in my life. That's the luxury of panic. And when you're really in a life or death situation, you don't have that luxury of panic. You just have to hold it together, and you have to be that person when it's not about you. It was about saving her life. So I was just there, and I was listening to what the doctor said and getting escorted off the hill by the ski patrol. But it took a long time to get over that. I worked with a therapist for a while. My first competition, which was like 5 months after that accident, I just like cried all day and I couldn't handle it. And then there was also in the US and Canada, we only bring helicopters on hill when it's very life-threatening. But in New Zealand and in Europe in the Alps, they bring it on if they think you're going to need to go to the hospital, because it's such a long travel to get down the mountain and out of the village and to the nearest hospital. And so that was kind of triggering. And then it ended up being like a helpful desensitizer to me that these helicopters kept coming on hill, and it didn't mean people were dying. It just meant that they needed a doctor. Like maybe they tore their ACL or dislocated their shoulder, something that's, I don't want anyone to experience, but it's not the same thing as having your fatality report written.
So that's one of the huge misconceptions about brain injury is that no matter how far along you are, everybody's brains always can use help and always can use healing. As we're getting older, everyone's brains are deteriorating. So the more we do to take care of our brain at every stage is better. So it gets to a point in time, like for me now, I don't really have anything that you can directly correlate to my brain injury, any symptoms. But sometimes when I get tired, I kind of forget things. But it's hard to know if it's exactly my brain injury because sometimes when Jeannie gets tired, she forgets things. Well, she's had a concussion. I had a traumatic brain injury. Millions of individuals have had some sort of brain injury. So we all want to take care of our brains and keep healing. But you aren't like set in stone with your deficits, even if you're 20 years out. I know individuals who have still made noticeable changes that they can really tell 20 years post accident.
So what's different about Jamie's injury versus a lot is hers was public immediately because it was at World Tour Finals, and that was a televised and public event. They didn't show the fall itself on TV because they had just enough delay time to not show it because they weren't sure whether that was going to be fatal, and they didn't want to show a fatal accident. But it did mean that the media was part of her recovery the entire time. So there was no part of her recovery that was completely private. So there was no part that was like, oh, the first time we told about this. So we've been working with media for 9 years around her accident and through all of the different stages. And like you said, we all have our own battles. And I just want to take this moment to kind of note that today is actually the 2-year anniversary of the passing of our older sister from cancer. And we've started to do a lot of policy work, which is kind of what makes MoCrazy Strong Foundation a little bit different than a lot of other brain injury foundations that do a lot more of the community advocacy work. We do a lot more of the high media work and the policy work to really be like, okay, in 20 years after Jamie's injury, how will someone who had a case like her be treated differently and have a better recovery? How can we make sure that, the statistics are continuing to get better and better and that the entire system is changing?
And it's interesting because one of the things that we've heard a lot, and I actually was just talking to a woman this morning about, is how alone people feel after a brain injury, which is really incredible because we had a film that we went on a film festival tour with, and every film festival, people came up to us and told us about their brain injury. The people we interview, like you, are talking about your brain injury. We've had senior policy staff members, we've had Olympians, we've had so many people talking to us about their brain injury. And there's just not this like understanding that most people have had some connection to brain injury. Either they've had one or they've been connected to someone who has one. There's literally millions and millions of individuals. There's over 1 million that are seen by a hospital. And then if you think about all their family members, all their caregivers, and all the people that are not seen by a hospital who have a brain injury, like the kid on the soccer team who has a concussion, all of those types of people as well. There's so many individuals in the US and globally affected by brain injury for it to have the amount of awareness and funding and attention that it has is something that we're going to change. The process physically was interesting because I had been an athlete my entire life. Um, I had stages where, as my mind was coming back, was like when I was leaving the wheelchair, and beginning to walk, but I had trouble walking. But I had already torn my ACL before, and so I had experienced times in my life when I hadn't been able to walk and learning how to walk. So I already had that understanding of setting attainable goals to reaching your growth goals and performing at your own personal best throughout the whole process. So my physical side actually returned fairly quickly. Well, like my mom and I started doing yoga right away. And when I say we were doing yoga right away, I still had lots of physical disabilities. So we would do very basic yoga and we would do it for 10 minutes. And 3 of those 10 minutes would be lying in Shavasana. So I relearned how to calm my mind down and let it go. But it was very basic. So that's one of the most important things of when you're recovering is if you think, oh, well, Jamie got back. So she was like, as soon as she left the hospital, doing hours of yoga and long hikes. That's not what happened. Like when I first started hiking, I couldn't hike for more than 5 minutes without needing to take a break. And my mom, who has a master's in psychology, she actually was like, why don't you reword what you're saying to yourself, Jamie, and what you're saying to others? Instead of saying, I need a break, why don't you say stop and look at the view? Then you will stop, you'll get your rest in, and we'll look at the view. And everywhere has an amazing view, which has turned kind of into a metaphor for everything in life. And my recovery is when you're going and you're feeling overwhelmed and you're tired and you need a break, just stop. Take some breaths and look at the view of your current life, your current opportunities, what you are currently doing, because there always will be amazing things that you might not have noticed unless you stop and actually take a breath when you're feeling that overwhelmed.
Our foundation, MoCrazy Strong, runs a program called the MoCrazy Method, and it's a virtual program that meets every other week for 6 weeks. And we go through different wellness modalities, and it's also like a uplifting support group. So our mom leads it, and it's all science backed. And then
very educational. That's a very,
yeah,
very educational.
and it's also a space to be able to, you know, help get rid of that aloneness where you're with other people and in a positive light. There's so many support groups that end up being a little bit too complaining about how hard life is. And this is about getting to be excited that this social interaction at the coffee shop was good or something like that, as well as the education behind the wellness modalities that we go through.
Yeah, and so each session there's six of them, and it has a different structure towards it, and it's taught by our mom, who prior to my brain injury had a master's in psychology and had studied early childhood brain development, and then post my brain injury is a PhD candidate on mind body wellness with a focus on traumatic brain injury because one of our goals is to get the complementary medicine to have enough backing and enough trials that it does start getting covered more and more by insurance and get recommended more and more by hospitals. It's not a this or a that, but using a complementary because the brain is so complex. There's so many little nuance things that can actually increase. Like if you do like self massage or you do like a partner massage, it actually increases the blood flow to your brain, which helps your brain pathways that are rebuilding. Because after a brain injury, you do have some damaged brain pathways that will never come back. However, we have trillions of synaptic connections and nobody uses all of them. Nobody, so it is possible to rewire your brain and get to the same destination by having a different path. But you need blood flow, you need nutrition, you need exercise to get and habits of creating these focused habits to rewire your brain and get to the end destination that you're looking for. I went back skiing. I went back 8 months with the National Ability Center in Park City, Utah. So I had people that were trained to deal with physical and mental disabilities, which was really important because they could help me through the steps and stages. Back to it pretty quickly. I had to relearn everything. So that winter, I actually decided that I wasn't going to go back to competing. And I made the choice, and it was one of the hardest choices I ever made because that was my identity. That was where everything I knew. But I also heard the doctors in the back of my mind and all the people who supported me, my family, and I really had a global community that cared, and I didn't want to risk that. So I've gone back to skiing, but I take much more calculated risks. An example of that is before my brain injury, if somebody was going off a cliff, I would be as well. And I have a husband who loves to go off cliffs. And I go away from them. And and we both understand that that's what needs to be happening. But I don't push myself anymore and I do take calculated risks. But a lot of people say, well, it's still dangerous to go back skiing, but I get in a car and the number one place for traumatic brain injuries is slips and falls in the bathroom. So unless you're going to tell me that you're never going to go to a bathroom again, I'm going to tell you that I'm going to go skiing.
I haven't really experienced nearly so much of like skepticism on brain injury. A lot of the conversation that we were just having in DC with elected officials, you know, across the spectrum of people was that there's a lot of attention around veterans and sports athletes, which Jamie is a sports athlete, but we're kind of forgetting the stories of the everybody else. And we were there with a bunch of people that were brain injury survivors. So it was all of these different stories. And one of them, the wife was away on a business trip and came back and found her husband unconscious. And actually relaying that story was something that really touched home with one of the staff members we were speaking to of just how vulnerable everybody is and how much everybody needs to have this kind of, you know, governmental community support if it happens to them. We're definitely in a community and society that we're mostly exposed to that's pretty well aware of brain injury. We live in Utah, which has a lot of outdoor recreations, a lot of bad weather, and actually a lot of neuro care, both in the hospital systems and then also through private rehabilitation and wellness centers as well.
Yeah. One of the things about like getting back into society, is when I had my accident, I was 22 years old. And so when I was like 23 years old, I wanted to go hang out with my friends and go to the bars. However, I was not at the state that I could control myself well enough. So I would go with my mom or Jeannie, and sometimes I would go up to the bar and order straight vodka, no cranberry. And they would come up and say, "She means straight cranberry, no vodka," because I wasn't drinking. I do drink recreationally. So I did go back to that. However, for multiple years after my brain injury, I didn't drink. And that's one of the things, if the people that you're with go out to the bar a lot, for you to understand that it's okay to get a cranberry juice and have it in your hand. And then you don't have to answer the questions all the time about why are you not drinking? And it's okay to do these types of changes and to pay attention to it. Like another example is when I was leaving, like when I was first couple years out, I had a friend and I called him 15 times because he didn't answer the phone. And I just like kept calling him, which is socially irrational behavior. So Jeanine was talking to me about it and I had to work on it. But just recognizing that a lot of brain injury survivors do socially irrational behavior, but that doesn't mean that it has to stay forever.
Yeah, I think that the social part is something that a lot of the systems we have for rehabilitation don't really address too much. Where we always say, like, Jane was basically born again and had to go through all of those stages of recovery. And if you spend a lot of time with children, you understand that you have to teach them social skills. You have to teach them that, punching someone because they said that they didn't like your shirt isn't appropriate, or that telling someone, that you don't believe in their religion, so that's bad, or something. Like, all of those social skills are actually taught to us in development. And people are either really scared to teach social skills to a lot of brain injury survivors because they feel like it's either offensive or like it's not their place, or that it's weird because they're an adult, or it's like they need to learn in that same kind of appropriate way that you would teach a child that, calling someone 15 times because they didn't answer the phone is inappropriate. You could leave a message or text them or wait for them to respond. And I don't think that the social skills have to be permanent. I think that a lot of people, though, walk around on eggshells and are like, oh, I can't be involved, and that's just the way they are, and they're different now, and they're weird, and like all of this kind of negative connotation, instead of being like, well, haven't you ever heard, like, have you ever spent time at an elementary school? Like, those kids don't have it put together, but they can by the time that they're adults. So brain injury survivors also can, learn appropriate social skills, but it has to be taught.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that also, like, a lot of these like post-acute care stuff, like the social skills, people don't really understand about brain injury. And it also makes it so that people who are brain injury survivors and have had recoveries, if it doesn't define them, they don't connect to it. So, like I mentioned, I know so many individuals who have had stereotypical successful recoveries and are doing really well in their life. And nobody knows that they're brain injury survivors. If somebody had breast cancer, they are a breast cancer survivor forever. But for brain injury, there's that stigma attached to it. So they're scared. Like they say, oh, please don't tell people about this because they're a senior staff member. They are very smart and they are able to accomplish a lot of things. So maybe if everyone knew that they had had a brain injury, they would not be treated the same way anymore. So people don't want to acknowledge that they had this brain injury, even though they did have it. And even if they stereotypically got over it successfully, they don't stay connected to it, which I think is something that's really challenging, because then when people are trying to get over it, there's not really beacons that they can look up to and be like, okay, I want to be like that. So here's kind of some of the steps that I can take to get in that direction. And every brain injury is different, but there are some similar steps that anyone who does it will help them. Like exercising is something that helps everybody. There's different forms of exercising. There's sitting, there's seat exercises, there's so many different kinds, but some kind of body movement, eating healthy nutrition. And there are foods that are better for your brain and paying attention to that and always trusting your gut above everything else. So like knowing that there's so many different ideas, but there's different things that will work for everybody. So keep trying them. If this food didn't work, it doesn't mean that everything that's a green food won't work. You can find something else. So I just want to agree with you that I think humor is one of the key things. You can either be embarrassed about yourself or you can just be a really funny show. And there's definitely a lot, especially at the beginning when I started coming back,
Yeah. I
that
used
Jeannie can
to
explain.
say that Jamie acted like a drunk 10-year-old, and not in a context that I have ever seen a child be drunk, but that she both acted like she was kind of an intoxicated and juvenile person at the same time. And it was pretty funny. Like we had a lot of friends visit when she was like in inpatient rehab and like shortly after coming out of the hospital. And we listened to a lot of music. She really fixated on the song Style by Taylor Swift. And we have this whole choreographed dance routine to it now. And as like 5-year-olds have their favorite song that they play and repeat, this was hers. So there was
Yeah.
a lot of that uplifting stuff.
Because I wanted to come back after I went crashing down, and I never wanted to go out of style. I never wanted to go out of style. So that's why I latched onto that song. And I even tried to dance on the tables in the lunchroom. Turns out that nobody thought it was a great idea to have a brain injury survivor dancing on the table. So I had to dance in the middle of the room. But I tried to climb on the table and then I did the whole choreographed dance to the middle of the room and then did some bows and got some applause and would do things like not directly humorous, but looking back on it, it just is so humorous. When I was leaving the hospital, I knew from a competitive athlete that when you get on that podium, you pop champagne. And so I wanted to pop champagne. I wanted to run through champagne. And my mom was like, Jimmy, you know you can't drink any champagne. And I was like, oh, I have no interest in drinking it. I just want to run through it and like celebrate because this is like one of the biggest accomplishments that I've ever done. I'm leaving the hospital. And so we got champagne and I ran through it. And then I had issues controlling my heat. And so I got so cold. And so I was just like shivering and I was just like chattering my teeth. And just like the whole experience was just like very lighthearted and humorous. And lots of little things like when I would forget things, or forgetting was like a very popular, like humorous thing. And then just making everything into a joke instead of feeling embarrassed about it is definitely a great way to go
We
along.
made a short documentary that premiered at Big Sky International Film Festival in February of last year, and it's gone on to be in 17 different film festivals. We've won multiple awards. We actually screened it last year during Brain Injury Day on the Hill in March in Washington, D.C. And yeah, so we've been all over the country, some international as well. And so it's doing really well. And it's going to be public actually through donation through our website at the end of this month. So right now it's been only through festivals and their online screening platforms, but this is one of the awards we got in Sicily. But yeah, at the end of the month, if you go to mocrazystrong.org for a donation, you're able to screen the film. And it's also going to be screening at our fundraiser event at Snowbird Resort and Cliff Lodge on the 23rd of this month.
Emotions took much longer to recover, and over 5 years to really regain my emotional stability. And one of the things that really helped with it was for me to be able to have this idea of this documentary. And I was one of the co-directors of it, as well as lead participant. And then I actually won an award for best lead role in Italy. And I was so excited. I was up on this beautiful old Italian opera house in like a 4-foot train and giving my acceptance speech. And it was a feeling that I haven't experienced exactly the same way since before my brain injury, of actually accomplishing something that the whole world would see as an accomplishment. And that was one of the biggest things, was for me to regain that successful identity and be able to accomplish what I really wanted to accomplish. Because for me, a lot of people say it's exciting that you lived, but I'm like, well, I just lived. I wanted to get back to being alive to thrive. And so that was one of the most wonderful things about this film, is it's been very well received. We also won the Audience Choice at Newport Beach Film Festival and some other awards. And it's just really exciting how every film festival we go to, there are multiple people in the audience who come up to us and tell us their brain injury story and how this film helped them realize that they do have the opportunities to continue healing and that they are not alone.